Yeah? It's on now. Yeah, perfect. Thank you so much for having me back. I do like coming here. I do also seem to choose really nice weather. So I have 20 minutes to tell you something about Humboldt, which is so unfair because he's like the most exciting person on the planet. So I'm going to rush through stuff. Hopefully we can talk a little bit about some other things during our conversation. But I wanted to start with a quote about Humboldt. This is what Ralph Waldo Emerson said about him in 1869. Humboldt was one of those wonders of the world, like Aristotle, like Julius Caesar, who appear from time to time as if to show us the possibilities of the human mind. Yet, when I told people over the last few years that I'm writing a book about Alexander von Humboldt, the most common reaction I got was a blank face, because very few people have actually heard of him. It probably doesn't help that I say Humboldt, which I noticed that you also say Humboldt, instead of saying Humboldt, which is the American way of pronouncing it. Because if I would say Humboldt, more people will recognize his name. But I'm kind of refusing to say Humboldt because I'm German, he was German, and since he's almost forgotten here, we might as well learn to pronounce his name properly, Alexander von Humboldt. His name, though, lingers everywhere. So, in fact, there are more places, plants, and animals named after Humboldt than anyone else in this world. And I'm just going to show you a few examples. So there's, for example, the Humboldt Current, which is the ocean current that hugs the west coast of South America. There is the Humboldt penguin, the Californian Humboldt lily, and there's a giant fierce squid, which is named Humboldt, the Humboldt squid. In Latin America, there are dozens of parks and mountains named after him. There are mountain ranges in China, in South Africa, in New Zealand. In North America alone, there are 4 counties and 13 towns named after him. There's a bay, there's a river, there's a mountain, there are parks. I could go on forever. Even the state of Nevada was almost called Humboldt, when the name was discussed in the 1860s. So the question is, who is this man? Well, let's start with a few facts. So he was born in 1769, the same year as Napoleon, and he was the second son of a wealthy Prussian aristocratic family in Berlin. And when his parents died, he was left a very wealthy man. In fact, he was so rich that he bragged, "I have so much money that I can get my nose, mouth, and ears gilded." So we also know he was a bit of a show-off. But he left his life of privilege and went on a 5-year exploration through Latin America, where he spent pretty much almost his entire inheritance. And it was a voyage that shaped his life and his thinking, and that made him really legendary across the world. He was a visionary thinker and scientist, and his contemporaries described him as the most famous man after Napoleon. They called him the Shakespeare of the sciences. He wrote many books, which were huge international bestsellers. In fact, he wrote so many books that he himself lost track how many he had written and when they were published. He was, as one contemporary said, the greatest man since the deluge. He influenced artists, scientists, writers, and poets. Thomas Jefferson, for example, called him one of the greatest ornaments of the age. Napoleon was jealous of Humboldt. Charles Darwin said he would have not boarded the Beagle and therefore not conceived of the origin of species without Humboldt. Henry David Thoreau's Walden would have been a very different book without him. John Muir's ideas on forest preservation were heavily influenced by him. Simon Bolivar called him the discoverer of the New World, and the painter Frederick Church followed Humboldt's footsteps to paint the South American landscapes. But he's also the one who followed most closely Humboldt's suggestion that the arts and the sciences should be brought together. And even Captain Nemo in Jules Verne's famous 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, owned all of Humboldt's books. So he died in 1859, just a few months before his 90th birthday, and actually a few months before The Origin of Species was published. And 10 years later, the centennial of his birth was celebrated across the world on the 14th of September, 1869. And there were parties everywhere, in Melbourne, in Mexico City, in Buenos Aires, in Berlin. You name it, they had parties. And some of the greatest celebrations were actually in the United States. There were, for example, 25,000 people who marched through Manhattan in his honor. So America was utterly in love with Humboldt, yet today he's almost forgotten here. So the question is, why should we care about a man who's dead and who's almost forgotten? Clearly, I think there are many reasons, because otherwise I would have not written this book. And I think one of the really important reasons is that Humboldt came up with a concept of nature that still very much shapes our thinking today. He came up with the idea that nature is a web of life. He described Earth as a living organism where everything was connected, from the tiniest insect to the tallest tree. He brought together the arts and the sciences when he said, for example, that we had to use our imagination and our feelings to understand nature. He's also the forgotten father of environmentalism, of environmentalism, because he warned of the devastating effects of monoculture, deforestation, and irrigation. And amazingly, he predicted harmful human-induced climate change already in 1800. So he was a genius polymath who roamed across the disciplines. He, for example, discovered the magnetic equator in South America. He also invented isotherms, which are the wavy lines which we see today on weather maps. He, more than 100 years before scientists talked about shifting tectonic plates, he was talking about the ancient connection between Africa and South America. He understood the idea of a keystone species 200 years before the concept was named. And he defined global climate and vegetation zones at a time when other scientists were looking through the narrow lens of classification. Now, all of this is incredibly important, but I think what's more important than his individual discoveries is that he comes up with a worldview, a holistic worldview that very much colors our thinking of nature today. So my book, The Invention of Nature, is my attempt to find Humboldt, but also to restore him to his rightful place in the pantheon of science and nature. And the great thing when writing and researching an explorer is that you get to travel to pretty amazing places yourself, obviously all in the name of research. And because Humboldt was a bit of a show-off, I'm going to be a bit of a show-off. So I went to Berlin, for example, to read his manuscripts in the archives there. And as you can see, that man has a terrible handwriting. I think that was the only bad thing about writing this book. In Quito, in the archives, I found his Spanish passport. He traveled with them through the Spanish colonies there. I went up the Antisana, which is a volcano in Ecuador, and at 13,000 feet, I found this hut in which Humboldt had spent a night. And at that moment, there were 4 condors circling above me, and a herd of wild horses suddenly appeared. So that was a pretty good moment. I paddled along the Orinoco in the rainforest of Venezuela. I walked around Walden Pond in freshly fallen snow. I went to the Yosemite Valley, where John Muir had implemented so many of Humboldt's ideas on forest preservation. And appropriately, when researching an explorer, I also experienced a hurricane, although admittedly not in Latin America, but when I got stuck in Hurricane Sandy in October 2012, and I just made it, I think an hour before I had to give my talk here coming from there, because Michael picked me up in Philadelphia. But the most exciting moment for me was when I finally climbed Chimborazo the volcano in the Andes that was so elemental for Humboldt's vision of nature. And as I walked up the barren mountain slope, my admiration for Humboldt grew with every single step. So I made it only to 16,400 feet, but he went even higher. But it was, he went up there in June 1802, together with his travel companion, the French botanist Aimé Bonpland. And normally I kind of tell the story, what they do, but we have to kind of shorten this now. So basically, they managed to get up to almost, to a little bit more than 19,000 feet. Chimborazo was almost 21,000 feet, and at that time believed to be the highest mountain in the world. So when they are almost at the top, Humboldt kind of looks down and he sees the kind of mountain ranges folded below him. And he's really standing on the top of the world, and his vision of nature clarifies in that moment, and everything falls into place. And what he realized is that the journey he had taken from Quito, which is about 100 miles north of Chimborazo, from Quito up the Chimborazo was like a botanical journey from the equator to the poles. So he had seen the tropical species in the valleys, like banana trees and palm trees, and then he had seen how the vegetation had changed with altitude. And this is one of his paintings or one of the paintings in one of his books. And this is his Naturgemälde, and this is what he does after he's been to the Chimborazo. And you can see all these little words in the cross-section of the mountain. These are the plants he finds at certain altitudes. So he looks at nature so differently to anyone else, because he looks at nature in terms of vegetation zones, and he realizes that a lot of the plants he had seen on this journey from Quito up the Chimborazo were similar to plants he had seen elsewhere on the planet. He had seen similar plants in the Alps in Switzerland, in the Pyrenees in Spain, and also in Tenerife. And he looks at them and he realizes that there are global vegetation zones, which are like these wavy belts which are slung across the globe. So no one had looked at nature like this before, because everyone else was still very much looking through, trying to make sense of nature through classification. But let me tell you a little bit about his exploration. So he and Bonpland left Europe in June 1799, and they spent 5 years in Latin America. And I'm going to have to skip over some really exciting bits, and you're going to have to read the book for that. But I wanted to give you a little bit of a flavor what kind of man Humboldt was. Well, first of all, he was unbelievably restless. He has a restless mind that really never stops until he dies. And he himself admits that he was impelled by a perpetual drive as if chased by 10,000 pigs. He was also obsessed with measurements, and he schlepped 42 scientific instruments, all packed individually in velvet-lined boxes across Latin America. He took, for example, a telescope, a travel barometer, a huge pendulum clock, and a hygrometer, which he used to measure the humidity with. But he was not just interested in empirical data. He also said that in order to understand nature, we needed to feel nature. So where other scientists were searching for universal laws, Humboldt said that nature must be experienced through feeling and imagination. He was really driven by this kind of sense of wonder. He was, of course, brazenly adventurous. If you take, for example, his journey along the Orinoco and the surrounding river networks, he and Bonpland paddled 1,400 miles along the rivers, 75 grueling days deep in the rainforest where very few white men had ever been. And of course, it made for dangerous traveling. Their boat, for example, capsized. They almost starved to death. They encountered dangerous animals such as crocodiles and jaguars and snakes. But they also encountered the most magnificent ecosystem on this planet. they encounter the most magnificent web of life in the rainforest. And Humboldt was interested in everything. And he tasted, for example, the water of the different rivers like a wine connoisseur. He was fascinated by plants and animals, such as the howler monkey, and listened to their strange bellowing cries that traveled for several miles through the jungle. He discovered the Brazil nut and subsequently introduced it to Europe. But he also was fascinated by the indigenous people. And he very often included them in his landscape paintings. He thought that he very often questioned them, and he thought, or he described them as the best observers of nature, the best geographers. And I just wanted to show you a couple. So these are beautiful, huge books. And you can see the three figures there. And here's a detail which is my favorite. Humboldt is, of course, the one with the top hat and the very muscular legs and bottom also. So he brought home sketches of Inca monuments and Aztec manuscripts, showing the Europeans that these ancient civilizations were sophisticated cultures with rich architecture and languages. But he also saw that humankind was destroying nature. And he realized that in particular in this area at Lake Valencia, which is an agricultural region in northern Venezuela. And what he saw here was that the trees had been felled to make way for cash crops, that then heavy rains had washed off the good topsoil, that also the water levels of the river, of the lake were falling because the farmers had diverted the water to irrigate their fields. And seeing the destruction here, the environmental destruction here, he's the very first to explain the fundamental functions of a forest for the ecosystem and the climate. He talked about the tree's ability to store water, the tree's ability to enrich the atmosphere with moisture, their protection against soil erosion, and also their cooling effect. And it was here at Lake Valencia that he first talked about harmful human-induced climate change. He wrote about mankind's mischief, which disturbs nature's order. And then, a few years later, he lists the 3 ways in which humankind was affecting the climate. And this is what he writes. They do this through the destruction of forests, through the distribution of water, i.e. irrigation, and through the production of great masses of steam and gas at the industrial centers. Pretty amazing. In 1832, we've not learned much from this. Humboldt and Bonpland traveled from Venezuela up to Cuba, and then they traveled back to what's today the northern coast of Colombia. They then traveled 2,500 miles south to Lima. Most of this, they traveled through the Andes. And as they traveled through the Andes, they climbed every reachable volcano there is. So by the time they reach Chimborazo in June 1802, they are the most experienced mountaineers in the world. And there's a wonderful letter that Humboldt writes to a friend in Germany from Latin America, where he first, in great detail, describes all the dangers he had encountered with jaguars and crocodiles. And then he ends this long letter with this question: "And you, dearest, how is your monotonous life?" So he is a bit of a show-off. In April 1804, after they had also spent a year in Mexico, they leave Latin America and they return to Europe. But Humboldt adds a little detour. He travels to Washington, D.C., because he wants to meet Thomas Jefferson, the president of the United States, as you do. And the timing of this visit was absolutely perfect because Jefferson had just acquired the Louisiana Territory in the previous year. And Humboldt had just spent a year in Mexico in the archives, a lot of time in the archives also. So Jefferson bombarded Humboldt with questions about their new neighbor, Mexico, and Humboldt delivered plentiful. So he basically unpacked his maps and his notebooks, and he spent 6 weeks in the United States. And I'm not going to talk about this because I hope that Eleanor is going to talk a little bit about it, so I can skip over this really quickly, but it's fascinating. In August 1804, Humboldt arrives in Europe, and he settles in Paris, because there's no other city at that time so deeply steeped in the sciences as Paris in the beginning of the 19th century. And he very quickly established himself as the center of scientific inquiry. And he spends more than 2 decades in Paris, and I'm going to have to skip over that too now. But in 1827, after more than 2 decades in Paris, aged 57, Humboldt decides to leave Paris and to move to Berlin, a city he absolutely hated for its narrow-mindedness. And one of the reasons was that the Prussian king had paid him for more than 20 years an annual stipend, and that the Prussian king was now requesting his return to the Prussian court. And having completely run out of money because he'd spent his entire inheritance on his explorations, but also on his many publications, Humboldt really didn't have much of a choice. So he moved back to Berlin very reluctantly. But he did manage to have some fun there, because 2 years later, he goes on yet another exploration. In 1829, he travels to Russia, an exploration that was paid for by the Russian Tsar, 10,000 miles, aged 60. And he did this all in less than 6 months. So he was really not calming down at all with age. And he collected the kind of data he needed to do this global investigation of Earth. And when he returned to Berlin after this expedition, he was fizzing with so many ideas that a friend said that Humboldt was steaming like a pot of boiling water. He was finally ready to write the book that would make him most famous in America. He wrote a book called Cosmos. It took him more than 10 years to write just the first volume. It was a huge international bestseller. It was translated into a dozen languages, and it was a book that was unlike any other book ever published. He took his readers on an incredible journey from Earth to outer space, from the tiniest fleck of moss to the highest peaks of volcanoes, from botany to poetry and landscape painting. Where other scientists were crawling into their narrowing disciplines, Humboldt wrote a book that did exactly the opposite. He wrote a book that connected everything and brought everything together. It was a portrait of nature pulsating with life, and it was really his declaration of love to nature. And in Cosmos, he wrote, for example, descriptions of nature may be scientifically correct without being deprived of the vivifying breath of imagination. So he brought together scientific observations, imagination, and evocative landscape descriptions. No one had done this before. And he wrote of a deeply seated bond which unites natural knowledge with poetry and with artistic feeling. And this was really the book that made him so famous in the United States. And my book is really as much about Humboldt as it is about the people he influenced. And I really do not have time to talk about this at all. So I'm just going to show you. So I had to pick 8 of them, which was difficult enough. Each of them gets a chapter in the book. There's the German poet Goethe, Thomas Jefferson, Simon Bolivar, Charles Darwin, Henry David Thoreau, the German scientist Ernst Haeckel, who coined the word ecology and who also brought together the arts and the sciences, John Muir and George Perkins Marsh, who wrote a book called Man and Nature in 1864, which I think is one of the most important environmental books ever published here. And I would just like to end with one little thing, just because I think it's important to remember why he is still so important. And normally I go into kind of great length here. Maybe we can discuss this a little bit later, but Humboldt comes up with this concept of nature, that nature is a web of life, and he is so interdisciplinary. And today, when we are trying to figure out the consequences of global climate change, his methods and his concept of nature, one of global patterns, I think is incredibly important. And almost too perfectly, 3 weeks ago when my book was published, there was an article published in the Journal of the National Academy of the Sciences where climate scientists had traced Humboldt's footsteps up the Chimborazo. So they had taken this Naturgemälde, they had looked at where he had found plants on which altitude, and they had discovered 210 years later, they discovered that the plants had moved 500 meters up. So they had used Humboldt's historic data in very, very modern climate change science. And so for me, that was really the moment where I thought, this has really come full circle for me. If someone like Humboldt can still be useful today, not just through his ideas, but even through his historic data. So I'm done, I think. That was such a rush.